Hello. It's an honor to be here. So I'm Tove Solander. I'm in gender studies. I know. Okay. So I'm here to present a small interview study I did with detransitioners in Sweden. And this is the first public presentation of this study. I have no publications yet working on it. So just some background. The profile of my informants, there were 7 detransitioners and 1 was technically a desister. She didn't go through any medical transition. She desisted while she was still on the waiting list to a gender clinic. There were 7 females and 1 male. They were aged 25 to 45 at the time of the interview. They did a medical transition from the late teens, very late, to the early 30s, so in no case as a minor below 18. They detransitioned from their early 20s to their mid-40s, and the time between transition and detransition was up to, in one case, nearly 2 decades, but more often around 6 years. And so everyone except the sister had undergone hormone treatments, and the male informant had only undergone hormone treatment, but all the females had also undergone mastectomies. And 1 transitioned longer ago, before, I think it was 2012, they removed the sterilization requirement to change legal gender in Sweden. So she transitioned before then, and this requirement was interpreted as more of a castration requirement. You had to completely remove the gonads. You were not allowed to save egg or sperm either. So she also undergone a full hysterectomy. But except for this one older case, most were in trans healthcare around 2014, and they were started to be seen by clinics around that time. So as you know from previous speakers, this was just at the start of a really, really sharp rise in referrals and diagnoses, especially for young people and especially females. So my interpretation of that is that I caught a first wave of detransitioners in my little study, that I caught so many who transitioned around 2014, or who began, really, who were referred, began their medical transition around that time. So I predict that we will see many, many more detransitioners, and that's without saying anything about the ratio going up or down, or we don't even know the ratio, but it's just because so many more people have transitioned since that we will see more detransitioners. I think that I can safely say that. So I will just present a few themes, recurring themes from my interviews. I think I have very rich interview material, and I can really only scratch the surface. But I think all of these themes are familiar to you, and they really resonate with the previous speakers as well. So I've just roughly grouped them into time periods. So some common themes before transition. Of course, almost all my informants were female, so the most common pattern for them was to be a tomboy or too masculine, insufficiently feminine for a girl. And some were same-sex attracted, but not all of them. It was certainly overrepresented compared to the general population. There were, I think most could be described as bisexual to some extent, not always their preferred self-description. But my only male informant, he clearly wanted to escape being a cis hetero man. You've heard this theme before. He wanted to escape his male heterosexuality. The ways into trans identification were very ordinary, unremarkable, I found. It's really like any trans biography or autobiography. It's about finding the right word. Like they said things like, oh, I found a word for what I was feeling. I found an explanation for why it was different. Of course, you have to be exposed to the ID. You can't identify as something you don't know exists. So, of course, there was some exposure to the ID. Sometimes they grabbed onto it instantly, and sometimes it took longer. But there's nothing, they don't stand out to me compared to transitioners in general. So sometimes it was the diagnosis of transsexualism, sometimes it was specifically non-binary identity, sometimes it was the idea that we have a mental gender. It was slightly different things, but they grabbed onto something. The transition coincided with a period of crisis, often anxiety, depression, suicidality. I'm not saying anything about cause and effect here, but it coincided. And I noticed something I call a slippery slope, which has been mentioned also by previous speakers, this tendency to go further than originally planned. So, for example, if you intended to just socially transition or just adopt a trans identity for yourself, there was a tendency to then medically transition as well and perhaps go further than originally planned. And the social transition seemed to sometimes escalate this crisis, and the medical transition seemed to sometimes alleviate it. Many described themselves as stubborn, convinced that transition was right for them, and their friends and family were mostly supportive, or at least resigned to the idea. Some had broken contact with unsupportive parents, but not permanently. So a couple of themes from this early period about the tomboys. So I've just collected completely anonymous quotations. I don't want to give them individual pseudonyms, but all the themes all the different quotes on one theme are all from different informants. I was very much of a tomboy when I was a kid. I wanted to become like the boys. Not that I wanted to become a boy. Since I was like 12, I somehow started to think that I should actually have been a boy, or that I was actually a boy. I became lesbian, or was lesbian, since I was 15, and was kind of masculine too, as a youth. I found out I was a lesbian when I was 15, and that was a bit related to trans. So there was a range here from emphasizing more not feeling like other girls or not fitting in with other girls, to more of a clearer tomboy experience, which was probably the most common, and to even clearer identification with boys, or conviction that one should actually somehow have been a boy or was really a boy in the wrong body, which I suppose resembles more the classical early onset gender dysphoria narrative. And in a few cases, they also connected this to a quite early realization of lesbian sexuality. And those two last informants also talked more about the various tensions and overlaps between a lesbian and trans identity, but I can't go into that, unfortunately. So another theme that was quite interesting and clear was the social dysphoria preceding the body dysphoria. So a few quotes on that. But I didn't have, I think, actually very much direct dysphoria of that kind before then. Rather, I think that's something that came a lot when I tried to start living as a woman and ran into all the difficulties associated with that. I experienced it very much like the social dysphoria came before the physical, and that it was after I found these words and started calling myself a trans person and took a gender-neutral pronoun and so on. I think bodily dysphoria develops primarily from being very uncomfortable socially, from feeling that you're not being seen the way you want to be seen, and things just getting awkward and weird. So as you can see, there were not as many quotations on this theme, and it wasn't all of them, but it was still a very clear, a recurring theme, I thought. So for some, there was certainly body issues preceding the trans identity, like eating disorders, body image issues, problems with puberty, sexuality, but mostly nothing that they now in hindsight really would describe as gender dysphoria. So it was much more common that they first adopted a trans identity, socially transitioned, and then started developing a much more intense social gender dysphoria, which then led to a more of a body dysphoria or sex dysphoria, which then led to a desire to change the body. the period before detransition or while transitioned. So after medical transition, there was sometimes a period of relative stability and optimism, but a lot of energy was still spent on passing, and probably they didn't quite realize how much at the time. So this was something they realized when they stopped doing it, how much energy they really spent on thinking about how they were perceived and how to pass. Those who had contact with trans activist circles had less or no contact. This wasn't all of them. Some were quite lonely in their transition. And the trans or gender identity stopped mattering so much. So the most common pattern was that they stopped hormones due to health concerns of different kind, sometimes personality changes, sometimes more of adverse health effects or suspected side effects. And they didn't think of it as a detransition. They just wanted to try and stop the hormones. But then there was a discovery that the gender dysphoria didn't come back or had receded, and there was a reconciliation with menstruation that came back in several of the stories, and a realization that they missed their breasts. And alternatively to this slow process, there was more of a sudden epiphany, a sudden ideological shift leading to a rejection of the trans solution, some even described it as their dysphoria suddenly just disappearing. Sometimes it could be because they watched a certain video or tried a certain therapy form or something. So, and it wasn't always even different informants. Sometimes the slow process and this sudden shift happen in the same person as well. So a few themes from this period, a few different quotations on passing as a man. The first doubts may have come when I started passing as a man completely, and everybody said he about me the first time they saw me. And I started feeling like it's not quite me they see. Yes, a feeling of playing a role. I prefer not having to come out and just letting them think I'm a guy over, keep fighting to be called they and be seen as non-binary. I sort of felt, well, I'm queer, or there's something non-binary, or it's important to me not to be fully a man. Socially, it's been a problem because I still have trouble being friends with men, and then I preferred hanging out with the women and talking to the women on all occasions, and then I think I'm weird. So these quotations are quite different. They deal with different kinds of situations, and the problems of being perceived as a man are different. For example, one wanted to be perceived as non-binary, but she gave up on that, and then she would rather be seen as a man than a woman. And in this last quote, it's about social situations, problems socializing with women because you're seen as this creepy guy. Other cases, they were very successful socially, very popular, ideal men, but they just felt that it's not quite right. I don't want to be just fully a man. And another important theme is how the dysphoria faded away. I started to feel differently about my body, and this thing about being perceived as a man or a woman stopped mattering so much. I experienced feeling very free when I was together with my partner. And the other quote is also about a partner. When I pressed him about it, he was honest about viewing me as a woman, and I didn't mind. The few times someone called me she or something, I just felt right, interesting, a refreshing change. I kind of stopped feeling dysphoric. I feel it's pretty much 50-50 how people gender me at work now. There's no dysphoria in it, but it's funny because I can really remember, it was just a short while ago that if people said he to me, it was very, very tough and a huge crisis. So in a couple of cases, they found a new partner that really made them feel secure and loved and seen, and they just didn't care anymore which sex or gender they were perceived as. And in other cases, it was perhaps about moving or changing jobs, or just over time, the trans identity just stopped mattering. So they reflect on this, how odd it feels that something that meant so much to them suddenly just doesn't matter anymore. And then finally, around or after the transition, I would say almost none of them endorsed this retransition narrative of transition and detransition being symmetrical processes. Maybe one of them did, to be honest, but they didn't see it as doing the same thing all over or a similar thing all over as when they transitioned. It was more like stopping doing something they had done, and descriptions like a huge relief or waking up from a dream. The detransition was described by, I think, all of them as socially more difficult and controversial than their transition, and some had lost friends, not over the personal decision to detransition, but over the ideological shifts and their changing viewpoints of sex and gender and trans issues. There was very often a turn to other ideologies, such as feminism, more often, and or spirituality, religion as healthier worldviews and ways of making sense of oneself and sex and gender. Most of my informants had contacted trans clinic, not always the trans clinics where they transitioned, but a trans clinic to inform them of the transition or get some practical help. But none of them wanted psychological support for detransitioners within the specialized trans healthcare, and this is exactly because the trust was so damaged. So they wanted support, but not there. But it's also the difficulty of, well, it needs to be specialized. There needs to be knowledge of the issue. So, and they had very varying attitudes to detrans activism. Some warned of similar dynamics developing as in trans activism. Some wanted nothing to do with the polarized debate. Others wanted more activism, and so on. So the quotes I've collected on this is they often developed what I think of as a more materialist or materially grounded understanding of sex. It's not exactly that I experience myself very strongly as having this sort of manly interior or something. Rather, it's just about being made a certain way. It's not that I started thinking that, no, I am a woman or anything like that. I was just, yeah, I'm a person who has this body and I was assigned this gender because of that. And that's just the way it is. I felt that I am a woman. That's just the way it is, you know. You know, the whole idea that I somehow suddenly walked around feeling like a woman or something, when I walked around like, shit, I fight every day to accept myself as a woman. So on the face of it, might look like these quotes actually contradict each other, because some say I feel like a woman and some say I don't feel like a woman at all, and so on. But I think actually what I get away from it is they try to articulate a very similar thing. And they keep returning to phrases like, that's just the way it is, it's just the way it was made. I think it's just radical acceptance is a phrase that's sometimes used, some of them use it, but just acceptance of reality, really. So whether you feel like a woman or not, etc., is less important. And some of them also gave me some thoughts on gender identity, which wasn't something I specifically asked about. I think it was quite a while ago, actually before I stopped the hormones, that I stopped identifying as trans. But I don't mean I saw myself as a woman. I just, you know, the act of identifying as such, it stopped. The concept of gender identity stopped meaning anything to me. I think I have a very hard time understanding what gender identity is. I don't have a gender identity. Plainly speaking, gender identity is bullshit. Yeah, that's also my favorite. But again, they have different opinions. Some were very diplomatic and respectful of others' gender identities, but some of them just rejected the entire concept as harmful in itself. But as the common theme is it didn't mean anything to them anymore personally. It wasn't important. So just some final thoughts in my 33 seconds. You can say all my informants were core or primary detransitioners. That is, they desisted from their trans identity. But I think my material calls into question whether there's such a thing as a non-core detransitioner. Is it really possible to just detransition medically and not have any sort of thought process around the identity? And also related to this, Can the reconceptualization of sex and gender be separated from the decision to detransition? Is it really possible to accept someone's personal decision to detransition if you don't accept the thought process that led up to it? Is that really even acceptance of their detransition? And body and mind are intertwined, so the trans identification often led to gender dysphoria and a wish for medical transition, and then reversely, going out of it, the medical detransition led to questioning the trans or gender identity. And just as a gender studies scholar, gender theories are, of course, part of this culture in which culture-bound syndromes like trans appear. And I know that might be controversial to call it culture-bound syndromes, but I think not in this room, perhaps, but clearly, I mean, it's an identity, a political position, a diagnosis, a recognized way of expressing distress. To me, it's clear it's a sort of culture-bound syndrome, and gender theory is certainly part of that culture. And I just want to add that the feminist concept of gender is, or at least should be, structural and social. It can't just be reduced to an individual identity or expression. So I think there's bound to be a tension there. It can't just be reconciled, even though people try to ignore that tension, especially in my field. But I think there will be, if you try, as soon as you try to make some kind of structural feminist gender analysis, there will be a tension with the trans activist concept of gender, which is individualistic. So, thank you.